Thank you. Thank you all for coming on such a sunny night. Thanks to James and Kieran for the invitation. It's really wonderful to be here and to talk about the Americans in Northern Ireland during the Second World War. So what I'm going to do tonight is try and give you as broad an overview as I can of the presence of the Americans here. I'll talk in a bit more detail about a couple of things. So one of the things I'll talk about is the experience of African American troops in Northern Ireland during the war, and I'll try and talk about entertainment, the political dimension, all of these sorts of things, and I'll leave plenty of time for questions at the end. So let's start. So they arrived here in January 1942. This is about 6 weeks after Pearl Harbor. So this is the first place in Europe, excuse me, that the American forces are stationed. Initially, about 6,000 arrive, and in the first wave in 1942, we have about 40,000 American forces in the country. In the autumn of 1942, they are deployed to Africa to participate in Operation Torch. They return in huge numbers in late 1943. So the second wave, by January 1944, there were 100,000 troops, American troops in the country. The population of Northern Ireland at the time is about 1.2 million. So almost 1 in 10 people here were American. And it's reckoned that there are about 300,000 Americans passed through over the course of the war. Now, this figure has been disputed, but it's certainly somewhere north of 200,000 passed through. Now, a lot of them don't stay for very long. For some, it's almost a staging area, and then they go to the south of England to get ready for the invasion. And they leave pretty much immediately after D-Day. By the summer of 1944, there are very few soldiers, American soldiers here. Now, the repair base at Langford Lodge, that remains. There are still American Air Forces in the country. There are some American Navy ships come in, but mostly the soldiers have gone. There's no real need for them to be here. And from this point, once the Battle of Normandy is completed, American forces can go directly from the States to France. Now, the question is why? Why send troops to Northern Ireland, and what are the problems that this is going to pose? Well, first thing to acknowledge is that this was the only self-governing part of the UK at this time. So we have a devolved government in Stormont. Now, you can tell I've given this talk before because I think you all know this bit. So as to when it was created, you know this bit as well. But this does have an impact on the presence of the Americans. Because what we get here is an exclusively unionist government. So often what we get with the American presence is that nationalists tend to ignore it and unionists celebrate it. So often what we see is we're getting a unionist narrative of the American presence here. This is also a region, as you'll be aware, that doesn't have conscription. Now, this is an issue because the American military is a conscript army. And there's a degree of resentment at times from young American men who are in uniform, often running up against or having conflicts with young men from here who are not in uniform because we don't have conscription. We're also living with the aftermath of the Blitz. What the Blitz does is it kind of, as other elements of the war, it brings Northern Ireland closer to the rest of the UK because most UK cities faced the Blitz, as indeed we did. Now, the Unionist government is keen to promote good relations with the Americans. This is a moment where Northern Ireland's history is kind of defined by more than simply sectarian divisions. This is a moment for the Unionist government, for Stormont, to try and project a more positive image of Northern Ireland. And they're helped in this because the response of nationalists, which I'll talk a little bit about more in a moment, is largely to ignore the Americans. So politically, nationalists tend to pretend the Americans aren't here. They're fairly difficult to avoid, and personal relationships on the ground are actually by and large pretty good. And this is give you a sense of just how widespread the American presence was. So on the left, we have all the army bases, all the military bases. So as you can see, they're pretty much all over Northern Ireland. And on the right, we have the Air Force bases. Now, this doesn't include RAF bases. It doesn't include British military bases as well. So they're everywhere across the country. They're also in very, very small places. And one of the things that is noteworthy, again, when we look at the sectarian dimension of this, is that lots of them are west of the Bann. Lots of them are stationed in places which have nationalist majorities. And you would think that this would create problems, but broadly, it doesn't seem to. So why send troops here? Why not just send them to England, send them to Scotland? Well, there are a number of reasons for this. So there's actually an American presence here in 1941. Under the Lend-Lease Act, which is passed in the spring of 1941, the British and the Americans have an arrangement whereby American technicians are sent to some to Scotland, but mostly to Derry and to Langford Lodge. And what they're doing there is building naval installations in Leesahalley, outside Derry, and an aircraft repair depot at Langford Lodge. Now, the UK government could have got Canadians to do this. It could have got British technicians to do it. It doesn't. It gets Americans, and this is really highly publicized. It's almost as if they want the Germans to know that there are Americans here, even though America is still neutral at this point. Then we have Churchill's attitude. Churchill actually requested Roosevelt send American troops in October of 1941. Now, those of you who know your Second World War history know that in October 1941, the Americans are not in the war. It's still 2 months before Pearl Harbor. Now, this was never a realistic possibility, but it shows shows Churchill's thinking to try and get the Americans more involved. And the precedent for this was Iceland. There were American forces took over British forces in Iceland. Iceland wasn't part of the war, whereas Northern Ireland clearly was. So there is a difference here. There's a fear, I don't think it's necessarily a realistic fear, but there's a fear that the UK is vulnerable to an invasion through ERA. So what people don't realise when we really think about the Second World War is actually there's a British garrison here of 70 to 80,000 troops. Now you can think about how problematic this would be if ERA does become involved in the war. What happens? Now, you might be familiar with, but the ERA, as was, its armed forces were split. Lots of them are on the southern coast in case of a German invasion, and the rest had their guns pointing over the border in case of a British incursion. So if the Americans are stationed in Northern Ireland and the necessity arises to go over the border, it makes more sense and it's going to be more acceptable for American forces to go rather than British forces. So what we have here is another aspect of this, and this again is not a realistic possibility, but the Americans war-gamed the idea of how quickly they could get to Dublin and set up a government there if necessary, if the Germans came in. And they reckoned they could be in Dublin within a day or two. There's a broader political dimension to this in that Roosevelt and Churchill did not like De Valera. And this was kind of a snub to De Valera, that there are American forces in a part of Ireland that he claims, and this is demonstrating that he's no jurisdiction over Northern Ireland. I think that's more of a side issue, but it's certainly something that is pertinent. It wasn't universally popular with the American military. Now, Eisenhower, and bear this quotation in mind because I will come back to Eisenhower later in the talk, he thinks this is a really bad idea. For a lot of Americans, a lot of American military thinkers, the war is in the Pacific. And anything that's being sent to Europe at this point is a waste of resources. And actually, the initial American deployment was going to be much bigger than it was, but these troops had to be sent to the Far East. And another reason which I've come across comparatively recently, and I haven't investigated, is that having the US forces here was part of the decoys that the Allies set up ahead of D-Day to keep the Germans guessing where the invasion was going to come. So if you have troops here and in Scotland, not that there were ever very many in Scotland, the Germans have to defend Norway. They have to divert resources there. I'm not sure how realistic that was, but it's out there as an idea. So their arrival is at the end of January. There were rumors beforehand. It seemed that the only people who didn't know where the Americans were going were the Americans on the ship, on the ships. The first one I'll talk about in a moment, Milburn Hankey, didn't know where he was going until he asked a sailor, and the sailor said, "Oh, that's Belfast. That's where you're going." Now, you'll notice something about the name of the first American soldier to set foot in Northern Ireland. He's called Milburn Hankey. He's of German extraction. He's from Minnesota. And a lot of the first deployment were from the Midwest. The government and the military here quickly set up a landing ceremony. And actually what happened was that another ship had docked and started unloading troops while Milburn Hankey was being welcomed as the official first American soldier. So he wasn't actually the first. And as with so much in our history, the attitudes were diametrically opposed. Unionists welcomed it. It put Northern Ireland at the forefront of the war effort, albeit briefly, and nationalists condemned it. So it's condemned by nationalists because they don't recognise partition, and De Valera says that they haven't asked to be invited. So the nationalist attitude, as I mentioned, is broadly to ignore the Americans. The Unionist press is keen to get quotations from American soldiers about De Valera, about Irish neutrality, and they kind of refuse to say anything. Most of them are of German extraction. They don't know and they don't care. But they quickly realise that they're not to say anything about this, anything that could make a headline. So, just a few things as well. The war, as I mentioned, does make Northern Ireland more British in inverted commas. What we see is that Northern Ireland moves more towards the rest of the UK. Partition becomes much more entrenched as a consequence of the war. And actually, it's a moment where Eire asserts its own independence and its own foreign policy. So it's a really important moment for all of these reasons. It also unifies Unionist opinion. The Unionist government is really not very popular, even with its own support base at this point. So it gives something for the Unionist government to rally around. And Unionists now rediscover links with America. For too long, it had seemed that America was partial to nationalism in the Irish conflict. And now Unionists find all these links that had been forgotten that go to the period before the American Revolution. And this is the attitude of the Belfast Telegraph to try and square the circle of, well, the American Revolution was against the British. And the Telegraph says, well, we don't really need to talk about that. We just need to talk about the fact that Ulstermen fought alongside George Washington and he called them their best troops and so on. One of the other things the Unionist government does is it sets up hospitality committees, which will entertain the Americans, keep them out of trouble, and also actually keep them from falling under the influence of Irish nationalism. There's a fear that as American soldiers of Irish heritage might fall prey to Irish republicanism. So it's a way of trying to keep them away from that. And as I say, it is a bit of a distraction from the problems that we have during the war. There are more strikes in Northern Ireland than anywhere else in the UK during the war. So, and one other thing is that the Prime Minister, J.M. Andrews, had a kind of flight of fancy that people would think this was the end of partition, and actually there was no prospect of that. So, the nationalist response is more negative. So they're as welcome as the Germans in Norway. that they're going to be ignored, that they came here without permission. And later on, in about October, the Archbishop of Armagh, Joseph McCrory, accused the Americans of overrunning Northern Ireland. The IRA campaign that began in the spring of 1942 was linked to the Americans. And this was something that the Unionists tried to make more of, that IRA attacks were against the Americans, and they never actually were. It's a kind of rhetorical campaign against the Americans. And after the initial protests, political nationalism really doesn't say anything about the Americans, and nationalist newspapers don't really cover their presence here. One of the things that the Ministry of Information found when it sent someone over to look at the presence of the Americans was that they were welcomed everywhere. And actually, where there was hostility was where there were no Americans. And this report concluded that actually the problem the Americans have, well, the problem is that the Americans are difficult to dislike. Despite how negatively predisposed you might be to the fact that they're here, they're ultimately quite difficult to dislike. This was the New York Times take on it, which is kind of cynical and actually a lot of truth to it. And it does sort of raise questions as to why they were sent here. And here we have New York Times cartoon taking a slightly different tack, but this is something that really goes with the Unionist narrative of the American presence. One of the big problems that the Americans faced was, what do they do when they're off base? So what do you do about American morale? How do you maintain this? Now, this being Northern Ireland in the 1940s, the cinemas weren't open on a Sunday. So that's one of the things. Pubs are not necessarily going to be open on a Sunday either. And there are concerns about this. So the Americans are often incredibly bored here. And how do we get around this? So there are a number of solutions. The Ministry of Information says, well, for a start, you need a newspaper, and this will become Stars and Stripes. You need better radio programming because the BBC is dull. So they get their own American Forces network later on. There's also a desire for a booklet to give the Americans the do's and don'ts of what to do while they're here. So entertainment off base is looked after by the Red Cross. And it tried to do this independently from local authorities, at least initially. So it didn't work in liaison with the hospitality committees. And their concerns are really around alcohol and vice. So keeping Americans away from the pub and the pickup. They had hosted a lot of dances, but they vetted all the girls that went to the dances. So anyone who looked dodgy didn't get in. And the head of the Red Cross, Louise Farrand, said that if they're doing these things, it's because they've nothing else to do. And there was also a perception that they can't handle their drink. At one point, she talks about, potchie. You have this drink called potchie. So the Americans get their own newspaper in the spring of 1942. It gets a Belfast edition, or a Northern Ireland, or a North Ireland, as it was initially, edition in starting 1944. And it ends pretty much after the Americans leave. And it reports on the Americans here. It was felt that they needed their own newspaper because there were so many of them here. And there's a kind of heartfelt editorial at the end of it. And it's all sorts of things, Americans doing stuff in the community, all of these kind of sort of soft focus news. Then we get this, the GI Guide to Northern Ireland. This actually doesn't come out until the autumn of 1944. And its advice is obvious, I suppose, in some respects. So it's written in an informal tone because these are young men. These guys are 19, 20, 21, that kind of age. And it's about being good, showing good manners to your host as well as your ally. And with classic understatement, it tells us that Irish history is endlessly complicated. And it talks a little bit about this. It talks about dating, drinking, all of these sorts of things. So don't boast. And bear in mind that American soldiers were much better paid than their British counterparts. And then we have this, local hospitality committees. These were set up by the Minister of Commerce and then later Prime Minister Basil Brooke, but I'll not talk too much about these. What this does do is it does give Stormont the control of the narrative and also what it's reporting to London. But these things do work very well. Most of the people who volunteer are from the unionist background, and we don't really see many Catholics appear in it or the Catholic Church engage with it. Okay, so drinking is a problem. Now, in the early 1942, there's one of the more minor Anglo-Irish crises, which is the Guinness crisis. There's a shortage of Guinness coming in from Dublin, and this has to be sorted out. The pub is really important. This is as the GI guy said, this is the social hub. It's a male social hub, and that's where a lot of socializing is done. And it kind of warns them to buy a round. You know, don't get too drunk, buy a round, and you'll be okay. Then there's potching. There are stories of Americans being offered potching without actually knowing what it is, with, I'm sure, hilarious consequences. And there's also an association between the pub and the pub is sometimes seen as a Catholic space. So you get this kind of report thinking that Americans are being corrupted, they're being sold dodgy alcohol in Catholic-owned pubs. And then there's Coca-Cola. I'll leave this picture up for a moment and I'll see how many cliches you can count from this Coca-Cola advert. The Americans were given rations of Coke and also beer. There was a Coca-Cola pledged that any American soldier anywhere in the world could get a bottle of Coke for, I think, 10 cents. Now, this advert didn't appear here. This is one of a series of adverts that would have appeared in American journals. The Americans bring their sports with them, and they don't ever really engage with local sports. So there's one reference to cricket. There's a few references to football. There are no references to GAA that I can come up with. But they bring their sports with them. So we have gridiron, or American football, is played. Baseball's played. There are games at Windsor Park and Ravenhill. Some of these celebrating the 4th of July in 1942. These are publicised. And the Belfast Telegraph in particular tries to introduce locals to these American sports. They also bring their music and their dancing. So what one newspaper calls jitterbug fever. And local women really embrace this. And sometimes they complain the Americans aren't quite as enthusiastic. Needless to say, this doesn't go down well in some quarters. The Bishop of Clocker warns about unchecked pleasure. And we have major artists come across. We have Kay Kaiser and his orchestra. They have a hit with Johnny Doughboy, Finds a Rose in Ireland. Glenn Miller visits. We have a whole range of celebrities. And a lot of the technicians, because they're here the longest, they form their own band. So we have, I think these guys are called the Jive Bombers, and they have all these kind of great names. There was also an attempt to write a hit. So we had over here in the First World War, a soldier based locally tried to write a hit. It didn't really become a hit. And Glenn Miller visits in the summer of 1944, actually after most of the Americans have gone. This is my favorite American embrace of local culture. Apparently, a Marine sergeant was boasting to a policeman that the Marines can do anything. And the policeman said, well, I bet you couldn't play the bagpipes. So this Marine sergeant goes to Scotland, buys a load of bagpipes, brings them back, and they set up a pipe band the Marines based in Derry. And according to one newspaper report, there was almost a rebellion when someone suggested they wear kilts. Now, the goal of this pipe band, they said, was to play in the victory parade in Berlin at the end of the war. They didn't get to do that, but they did come third in the Clocker bagpipe competition. So I think fair play to them. And they wore a shamrock on their shoulder to represent the fact that they were the, quote, Irish Marines and had done this. Now, Americans seemed exotic. They seemed as if they'd stepped off the silver screen, and this was most people's reference point for the Americans. Their uniforms were better, their pay was better, their teeth were better, and they just seemed, local men couldn't compete with this. So there's a lot of resentment about this. There's also inevitable consequences of this. So what were euphemistically known as unruly houses. One of the reports I read had a list of premises throughout Northern Ireland which were out of bounds and had this house, that house, and my favourite line in it, and all of Amelia Street in Belfast, which is, those of you who know, I think it's the bit round the back of Robinson, so they were not allowed to go there. We see moral vigilantism. So there's a former missionary who goes around Belfast City Hall at night with a torch looking for canoodling couples, and she gets assaulted and someone hits her or throws something at her. There's the recruitment of female police officers later in the war. Often it's women who are blamed for this. This is women being put in temptation before the Americans rather than the Americans going out and looking for temptation. Now, in reports, sexual assault doesn't really feature. I haven't been able to find very much in court-martial records about Americans charged with sexual assault. So it's a hidden problem that we really don't know very much about. And lots of Americans do marry local women. It's reckoned about 1,800 local women marry Americans, and there are about 600 kids by the end of the war. The first marriage takes place in the spring of 1942, so that April. So they haven't been here very long before we have the first wedding. The soldier involved probably avoided court-martial because it was so highly publicized. One of my favorite anecdotes, or one of my favorite stories about this, is at the end of the war, 1946, war brides were not getting back to the States. And they basically went to the US consulate and occupied it and made the consul do something. And to his credit, within a couple of months, he got most of them to the United States. So I want to talk a little bit about African-American troops in Northern Ireland. And I want to start with an anecdote. And this may or may not be true, but it's a great story. An African-American soldier goes into a shop in the village of Bessbrook, and the girl behind the counter says, "Can I help you, sir?" And the soldier purportedly looks behind him to see who she's talking to. And he said, "I've been called a lot of things in my time, but I've never been called sir." There's another incident where, I can't remember the name of the village off the top of my head, but the soldiers see an advert, "Dance for the Black Men." And they think, this is great. They've organized a dance for us. So they all show up at this hall. Okay, we know where this is going. And they're not allowed in. And they think, well, this is Jim Crow racism. And obviously what could have been an encounter with racism is actually an encounter with the peculiarities of local custom. For the most part, it seems that the response of the locals to African-American troops was positive. But we shouldn't overstate this. There were problems, and it wasn't it wasn't as ideal as it could have been. But what we do have are African-American soldiers who are in a segregated military, who are used to being treated as second-class citizens, are used to being abused by white people, are in a place where they're among white people who treat them well. And this is a novelty. And obviously this happens across the UK. And they're regarded as being more polite than white soldiers. Here's some of the responses. So the Consul General, Parker Burnham, doesn't think black soldiers should be sent, thinks it's a bad idea, and actually thinks it's never going to happen. And then within a couple of days, it does. Within weeks, actually. So the local gossip is better informed than the American consul. This is a problem it's across the UK. The UK government didn't want black soldiers. but the Americans told them they had to accept them. So the question becomes, will there be a colour bar? Will we have segregation in the UK? And the answer ultimately is no. Now, this falls to Basil Brooke as Minister of Commerce. And Brooke found this difficult. He didn't want to be seen to be discriminating against American soldiers. Now, obviously, there's an irony in this when it comes to Brooke and his attitude to the Catholic population in Northern Ireland, but he couldn't countenance treating African American troops any differently. But there are a lot of discussions about this. And, you won't really be able to see this, but what happens is the Home Office sends over advice for chief constables. And the advice is that we will not police segregation. If the Americans want to segregate a pub, so that pub over there is for the white troops, that pub's for the black troops, that's their business. We're not going to intervene. We're not going to police it. And this is something that Brooke adhered to. And local attitudes varies. This is from an American woman who wrote to Eleanor Roosevelt. And this woman actually, Isabel Kennedy, worked for the Red Cross in Belfast. And it's the inference here is that the people will be friendly, but they're not quite sure what to do about this. And this friendliness might be misconstrued and so on. And here we have a letter, and you see this kind of racist language in it about fears of what would have been called miscegenation at the time, so mixed race kids. And here we have Dara Parker, a Unionist MP in County Tyrone, who's implying that African American troops hang out with what she calls the lowest girl, who are often from the minority, not exclusively, but often. So you have this intersection of racism and sectarianism. And then we have this anecdote from an African American soldier, which alludes to the fact that everything wasn't as good here as we might be allowed to believe, that there were problems. And the main problem relating to race in Northern Ireland is between the Americans themselves. African Americans often went out in groups for safety reasons. And white Americans, as we'll see, really resented African American troops being well treated, for misbehaving as they would have seen it, for dancing with local women. And this causes a lot of resentment and quite a bit of violence as well. So there are ways in which this is managed. The key way is to basically self-segregate. So certain pubs in certain towns are set aside for white troops or American troops. There's also attempts to create liaison committees within the American military, which really don't work. And I got this from Eamon McHale, who's from OMA, and talks about the fact that there's occasionally informal segregation. People's motivations for this are varied. I know that in England, pubs would sometimes be whites only, because if they weren't, white soldiers would come and trash the place. So we have to be very careful about generalizing about the experiences of African-American troops. There's also an element of color blindness up to a point. So Americans emphasize race, whereas locals don't. And here's an incident here where black soldiers get involved in a brawl in Belfast. And if you see the American response here, color is emphasized. The Lord Mayor of Belfast response just talks about Americans. The Americans are usually well-behaved, Americans, da-da-da-da-da. So not that we didn't see race, it wasn't emphasized to the same degree. And this is a bit more from Dara Parker. And she's talking about the arrangements in and around Cookstown, Macrofelt, this kind of area. And she seems to think that the African-American troops are getting more favorable terms than the white troops. Just a few other things. Positive responses from black troops about their experiences here. Again, not universal, but this has come from male censorship reports. So in theory, unfiltered. And then we get white American attitudes, which, as you can see, sort of drip with resentment about about black troops, and particularly interracial dating. And this is again from letters home from white troops. And this brings us to a kind of notorious case in 1944 in North Belfast, where an African-American soldier called Wiley Harris murdered a pimp called Henry Coogan in a drunken dispute over money to be paid to a prostitute. Now, don't need to go into too much detail about the case, but how it was reported, I think, is interesting in that race is very rarely emphasized in the local newspapers about this. And there's also a petition or petitions to try and get the death sentence on Harris to be commuted. Now, one of the things this reveals is the lack of jurisdiction that Stormont had over the misbehavior of Americans. Under the Visiting Forces Act of 1942, the American authorities had jurisdiction if their soldiers committed crimes. So Brooke infers, when he's talking to the Governor General, who wants clemency, that if Harris had been put in front of a local court, he would have been charged with manslaughter. He went to an American court-martial and he was executed. Now, it's worth mentioning that 18 Americans were executed in the UK during the Second World War. 12 of them were African-American. 10% of the American forces were African-American. So you can draw your own conclusions from this. And some of the correspondence to Brooke suggests that race does play a part in this. Okay, so a few points to finish on. The Americans disappear after D-Day. In late May, early June 1944, there's a massive American fleet in Belfast Lough. And according to the local press, it pretty much disappears overnight. And it's worth stressing that a lot of these guys pass through. They literally come in, they spend a little bit of time here, and then they move to invasion stations in the south of England. Eisenhower visits in August 1945. So we've had VE Day, and obviously there are massive celebrations around VE Day. But when Eisenhower visits, it almost matches this. There are tens of thousands of people in Belfast. Office workers are given the day off. He's given an honorary doctorate from Queen's, and then he comes to Stormont to give a speech. And he says this, that without Northern Ireland, I do not see how the American forces could have been concentrated to begin the invasion of Europe. So it's a far cry from his initial criticism of the decision to send troops here. And I'll leave you with this, or a few other things. So what's the legacy of the American forces here? I think it's kind of difficult to measure. One of the ways of thinking about the Americans is that this is an interlude. This is a period that lasts about 3 years, and then we get back to what passes as normal. So the legacy of it is physical. So the infrastructure that the Americans left, the memorials. So the memorial at Lisnabrini to about 150 Americans who died here during the war. The landing memorial in Belfast City Hall. And other little memorials, including one on the Cave Hill for a plane that went down and the 7-man crew died. There's a particular narrative that's crafted out of this, and this idea of an Ulster American narrative. So that actually Ulster, as was America's first ally. That Ulster American or Ulster Scots immigration predates Irish immigration by over 100 years. So this kind of, we were here first. The idea that John F. Kennedy is not the first Irish-American president. There were 13 American presidents before him who could trace their roots to what is now Northern Ireland. So there's an attempt to craft that sort of narrative. And this also continues with the memorialization. So there's an attempt to create a war memorial building after the war. It doesn't actually open until the 1960s. There's an attempt by the head of the Armagh Observatory to get money for a planetarium and use that as a memorial to the Americans. There are also other ways in which you can see the American presence. The Americans left behind a lot of buildings. So in Derry, for example, and also in East Belfast, these become homes. People squat, they occupy these due to the housing shortage. And this happens across the UK. But I do think it does fortify partition in that the separation from 1921 has become more permanent because of Irish neutrality and because of Northern Ireland being a belligerent. And the experiences of the people are different as a consequence of that. It has consequences for ERA in that it becomes quite isolated due to its neutrality. Now, as more than one person from Dublin pointed out, the Americans and the Russians only got involved in the war when they were attacked. We haven't been attacked. Why would we bother getting involved? There's basically nothing in this for us, which I think is fair enough. And I think, although the De Valera is criticised rightly in many ways, I think this is in some respects, keeping ERA out of the war is perhaps his finest achievement as a leader. And as I mentioned at the outset, Northern Ireland becomes more British as a consequence. So we've had the experience of the war in a very similar way to the rest of the country, partly because of the Americans, but I think even more so because of the Blitz. And it's not an opportunity for a reset of sectarian attitudes. This isn't a moment where we look inwards and think, you know what, maybe there are other solutions to this. What we see is further entrenchment of unionist rule, and then immediately after the war, we see the launch of an anti-partition campaign, which has been kept quiet during the war. We see that both within Northern Ireland and from Dublin as well. So this doesn't bring us together necessarily. And I will leave it at that. So I'm very happy to take questions. I've got a couple of other slides which I can just put up for illustrative purposes. And if anyone has any questions about any of these or any aspect of the American presence, I would be delighted to answer them. Thank you.
Were people segregated in the American army? You see photographs of black people and you don't see white people.
What I'd like to show you, if I can rewind, there's a picture here of black soldiers in Cookstown. And what you'll see, it's very difficult to see, but the only white American in the picture is the officer. So they usually have white officers. At the start of the war, I think there were like 10 or certainly fewer than 20 black officers in the entire American military. So they're completely segregated with white officers. And the Army's attitude was that the Army is not a place for social experimentation. A war is not a time for social experimentation. And Eisenhower's attitude was that the military reflects the society it comes from. The society it comes from is segregated, therefore the military is segregated. It's not a great argument. And what actually happens in the Battle of the Bulge, late 1944, Eisenhower's forced to take black troops and integrate them, and it works incredibly well. And then Eisenhower decides he would like to continue this, and George C. Marshall, his boss, says, no, the emergency's over. We go back to status quo.
Sorry, could I just ask one question, please? And I'm open to correction here, please. I had the impression that the black troops, the American troops who were arriving, the first arrivals were wearing gas masks or carrying gas masks. Would that be correct?
I believe so. If you look at, my book just here, there is, I'm pretty sure there's a gas mask pack on this. I think they continue to carry gas masks until D-Day. Although obviously it wasn't used as a weapon in the war, but I think they did carry them. Something else about the uniform, we don't associate the sort of First World War British helmet with the Americans. They get their new helmets. Apparently they were already ready at this point, but they went with these helmets because they were familiar. So if you had a bunch of soldiers marching with the modern American helmet, people wouldn't know who they were. But they get the modern helmet a bit later on.
My question is infrastructure. Did the Americans, when they came, they left, did it leave behind much of an infrastructure as buildings or roads, or was there any benefit to Northern Ireland from them being here?
In terms of infrastructure, not really. Just the informal occupation of old bases due to a housing crisis. They were seen as being very wasteful. So when they left behind lots of rations and all sorts of things. Now, I know that this, I live and work in Plymouth, and I know that in and around Devon, they practice building roads. So for the D-Day invasion, but I'm not sure if we have that here. But obviously you have the remnants of airfields in particular, which are quite difficult to remove.
There's enough concrete, I think, used at Langford Lodge as would made a motorway from Belfast to Enniskillen.
Sorry, sir?
There seemingly there's enough concrete used at Langford Lodge as would laid a motorway from Belfast to Enniskillen.
I think I could be wrong about this, but I think Langford Lodge at the time might have been the biggest infrastructure project in Northern Ireland's history, possibly Irish history at that point. There was so much material coming into it. And one of the things that they did, they'd fly bombers direct from North America. And sometimes these would crash coming in because they'd be rookie crews. But they also created fighter planes and took them to Belfast Harbour. And one of the reasons it was chosen was because you have a harbour and an airfield next to each other. So they get them, uncrate them, fly them to Langford Lodge, equip them, ship them over to England and ready for the air campaign.
Hi, Simon. Thanks for the talk. I'm just curious, what sources did you use when you were writing your book? I mean, I know from conversations with James, he had some difficulty finding out information about some of the black soldiers in and around Lisbon. I'm just curious what sources you were able to interrogate.
The Prony is an absolute goldmine of material. That's why the project got so much bigger. So there are files and files of stuff at Prony about the Americans. Belfast Newspaper Library has at the time 4 daily Belfast papers plus all the regional papers, and then a lot of stuff in American archives. So the National Archives and Records in Washington, D.C. So I get it all from the American perspective there. I was saying to James earlier, and possibly I might have been saying this to you, but if I'd done this project 20 years before, I would have been able to do oral histories and talk to a lot of people who lived through this. Unfortunately, with this, I only got a few, although they were incredibly useful.
Thank you very much for being part of our VE Day 80 Talks programme, and safe home, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.